Brilliant. Great. Well, thank you so much again, everyone, for joining and for joining this yet another EES lunchtime lecture. And I'm very excited to be here, not just because this is one of my rare occasions where I get to kind of sit in and drink some of this in, rather than Charlotte getting all the fun. But this is a very exciting talk because we're going to hear about the fall of Egypt and rise of Rome from Guy de la Bedouillère, who you may know from various outlets, not in the least from Screen, if you are a fan of things such as Time Team and such, where we had Guy has had a very illustrious Screen archaeological and historical career, but also has written on a variety of subjects with a history across various periods, including the Pharaohs of the Sun book, which I know is very well liked and appreciated. And thank you very much for joining us today, Guy. And Guy is also a campaign champion of the EES's ongoing Building the Future campaign to create a cool new redeveloped accessible offering here at the EES. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon to everybody who's joined this talk. Now, as Ed has explained, I'm going to be talking to you about my new book, The Fall of Egypt and the Rise of Rome. It's going to be a bit of a roller coaster. I apologize right from the word go. This is 300 years of Egyptian history wedged into 110,000 words, which I now have to insert into less than 45 minutes. There's an awful lot of slides, so I'm going to power away with it immediately. So there we are. There is David Roberts' painting of Philae, that wonderful temple of Isis, right the way up beyond Aswan, and of course moved now to the island of Algilkia. That has to be the quintessential image, I think, of Ptolemaic Egypt, which is what we're talking about, that last dynasty of Egypt, and of course non-native Egyptian rulers who came from Macedonia. And although Philae probably has earlier origins, a lot of the structures that you can see in that painting there are of Ptolemaic date, those last 300 years of nearly 3 millennia of ancient Egyptian history, recorded history that is. And of course there are some features in that picture which are of Roman date, and that's quite an interesting thing because the Romans very much inherit the administration and organization of Ptolemaic Egypt and have the wit and sense to carry it on. However, let's just have a very quick look at what we are talking about with Egyptian history. Now, if we, the New Kingdom, which is probably the most popular and most to many people, the most interesting part of Egyptian history, that is well over 1,000 years, or much of it is over 1,000 years in the past by the time you get to the Ptolemaic period, and perhaps a little bit less than. But it's if you go to the 26th dynasty, so quite late in Egyptian history, 664 BC, that's really the last seriously major revival of Egyptian culture. And of course, it gets punctuated after little over, just under 150 years, I suppose, by Persian rule, and you've got the dates there, that lasts well into the 4th century BC. And then you've got the last couple of native dynasties of Egyptian rule. And once again, the Persians are back at 343 BC, and they rule Egypt there for another 11 years. And on the side there, you've got Nectanebo I, and there's also Nectanebo II, who is the last native Egyptian pharaoh. So we are right at the end of a very, very long period of time. And of course, if you look at the two pictures I put there, they're instantly and quintessentially recognizably Egyptian. And that's a very important point, isn't it? Because Egyptian imagery, the whole cultural imagery of Egypt, although it changes throughout that period, there's a huge amount of continuity. And one of the interesting factors about non-Egyptian rulers who come in and take over the country is that they tend to go native, and in how they choose to appear. And that is even true in the Roman world, although the Romans inflict themselves on most other parts of the world. When it comes to Egypt, yes, they inflict themselves there too, but they pose on the temples as Egyptian pharaohs, picking up this very, very long tradition. So that's where we are with Persian rule 343 to 332 BC. And some of you may have been here, Tuna El Gebel. This is the tomb of Pet-Osiris, the temple tomb. And no one actually knows exactly when Pet-Osiris was a priest, with this wonderful tomb here. possibly towards under Nectanebo the second, possibly under that last bit of Persian rule. There certainly is a Persian monument, Persian style monument just outside it, or whether it in fact runs in even to Ptolemaic times. We don't know. But it's one of the most beautiful Egyptian buildings I think I've ever seen. And again, although there's a new tradition here, there are elements of this that are very obviously late Egyptian, and it particularly in the reliefs in it, which show a distinct classical influence, there is still that essential Egyptian ingredient in the building. Now, the decisive moment in all of this is 333 BC, because this is when Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king, defeats Darius at the Battle of Issus. Now, this is a mosaic from Pompeii, but taken evidently from a long-lost painting. Now, this really is one of those moments in history where you really can say that if the battle had gone the other way, the whole history of the ancient world and therefore the modern world might have been totally different. The defeat of Darius really does end Persia's aspirations and ambitions, and it means that Alexander the Great is free to reign free across that part of the known world and conquer further and further east over the territories. And Alexander is such an important figure because he was a remarkable individual in the sense that he was totally reckless. He was an ingenious general, but he didn't do anything very comprehensive to establish his empire on a secure footing with a full administrative structure and to make it durable. He was also not particularly interested in his legacy and really how he was going to who was going to rule after him. He was really quite a young man, so perhaps it's not terribly surprising. He becomes the principal pivot point of the sources. What I put up here is just a kind of summary of the sort of information that we have available to us to discuss this whole period that is going to come as a result of Alexander the Great in Egypt and what comes after him right down to the end of the ancient Egyptian period. So yes, you've got coins, and there's one on the left there with Serapis and Isis and the Ptolemaic eagle. You've got the written sources. Now, these are crucially important to us for two reasons. A, that we've got them, and B, that they are so grossly unsatisfactory. For a start, they're nearly all written later. Arrian, who you can see there, did not write until well into the Roman imperial period. Diodorus Siculus, 1st century BC. Polybius a little bit earlier, but they are all predominantly writing about, not entirely in Polybius's cases, usually writing, and certainly totally in Arrian's case, about things long before them. There is no ancient author who sat down to write a history of the Ptolemies, at least one that has survived. So we haven't got that. We have largely incidental references, and Arrian was really only interested in Alexander and the period immediately after him. And that is one of the problems, a kind of fixation with a particular focus, not interested in providing us with a breakdown, a full sort of narrative history of the Ptolemies and an analysis. You don't really get that. What we do get is a very prejudicial depiction of the Ptolemies. It's always because it suited the Romans' agenda to see the Ptolemies as the quintessential demonstration of the corruption of absolute power, the sink into the abyss of indulgence and of course incest, which was a source of fascination to them, all the while ignoring, setting to one side conveniently, I suppose you could say, the corruption of the Romans themselves through imperial power. At the top right, you've got papyri. Now, this is so important to the understanding of Ptolemaic Egypt because papyri are the ephemera of everyday life. They don't provide us with narrative history, but what they do provide us with is a gigantic amount of information about the administration. And of course, it was in Greek. And that doesn't carry with it quite the same problems of interpreting ancient Egyptian, which is a completely different form of language and a wholly different form of expression. So armed with the papyri, which of course survive in Egypt because of the unique preservative conditions of the desert, armed with that, we have a remarkable amount of information about how Ptolemaic Egypt was administered. And then, of course, you have got the hieroglyphic monuments, which are normally belong to the tradition, the bunctious tradition, if you will, of Egyptian stele and reliefs, which big up the pharaoh, how the enemies of Egypt are all moronic idiots and completely incompetent, and the pharaoh is essentially the godlike intermediary between men and the gods. So armed with those, we'll just march on here. Alexandria. So the rise of all this, I'm going to have to rattle through this very quickly. I may well have to jump through a lot of slides. I'll warn you in advance. That is the extent of Alexander's empire. And that shows you what he had done. He'd managed all this. He takes Egypt as a part of his as a part of this monumental empire, but having been there for only a short period of time and found oracular validation at the shrine of Ammon at Siwa in the Western Desert, which is what he wanted, the proof that he was destined to be king. He goes and he never comes back. He does, of course, found Alexandria. There was a village already there, but Alexandria is going to become the set-piece gateway between Ptolemaic Egypt and the rest of the known world at that time, making Egypt more outward-looking, or at least the Macedonian version of Egypt. Now, this is a statue, a bust, rather, of Alexander on the left, highly idealized, and some of you will recognize there on the right that that is from the bark shrine at the back of the Temple of Luxor, and there is Alexander the Great with our moon, of course. There he is being with hieroglyphs, his name transliterated into hieroglyphs. That's up there at the top there on the right next to the Ankh sign, and with his throne name as well. And that is exactly how Alexander chose to be depicted, unless of course this was actually produced posthumously by the Ptolemies. So this is the new image, if you will, of the Macedonian as it's going to be Ptolemaic Egypt, which is the Hellenistic style, classical sculptures on one hand, but also these public monuments where you maintain ancient tradition. And there is the shrine of Siwa, what's left of it in the Western Desert, and that is where Alexander went. It was absolutely essential to him to have this. It was almost certainly staged for his advantage and his benefit, but that is what he wanted. And it didn't go down too well with some of his troops, who thought that his pretensions to this kind of divine-like sponsorship were really getting a little bit ridiculous. And there's a little bit more of Alexander. That's a water, I think it's a water clock on the right-hand side there from Alexandria. And on the left, you can see the cartouche, Alexandros, it says there in hieroglyphs. Now, Alexander, of course, famously dies suddenly in 323 BC in Babylon. Now, I could talk for hours about that because but I'm not going to. It's an absolutely fascinating incident because no one expected it to happen. And because no one expected it to happen, they ran around like headless chickens the moment that it did. And they really don't know what to do because there is no automatic setup. There is no automatic succession. And in the end, what has to happen is that Alexander's followers decide to divide the empire up. They will rule the sections, but all under the auspices of Alexander's half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, who is supposed to have been intellectually challenged, and Alexander's posthumously born son, Alexander IV. Now, again, as I said, it's a massively long story. The upshot of it all is that all these individuals begin to realize their own ambitions. And I mean, there are more people than I put up here, but these are essentially the most important ones. And it's Ptolemy who is given Egypt to manage. Now, to begin with, they all do so as satraps, as governors within the Alexandrian so-called system. But as their ambitions take over, of course, they begin to establish themselves as kings and establish their own states. And what follows are the Hellenistic kingdoms, the celebrated Hellenistic kingdoms, who then spend most of the next 300 years fighting amongst one another. And that's because, as I said earlier, Alexander's empire is like a cloud. It's a whole diaphanous load of sheets blowing in the wind. There is no substance to it. So they all individually state-build. And it's Ptolemy, and incidentally, that word comes from the Greek polemos. It's an archaic Homeric spelling, and it means sort of warrior. It's Ptolemy who is really the most successful in doing so in Egypt. And one of the first things he does is he makes sure he pinches Alexander the Great's body. And he intercepts the catafalque, which is probably on its way to Macedon, and he makes sure it goes to Alexandria, where he is going to use it as a set piece in his capital city, knowing full well that that will legitimate his power and control. Now, at the top there is an Alexander, that's often said to be Alexander, it's not actually, it's Heracles on the left there, and Zeus on the obverse, and it says Alexandrou, and that was struck in Memphis during Ptolemy's time as governor there. But within a few years, he has established himself as king, and then at the bottom we've got a tetradrachm of Ptolemy. And it's a reduced silver standard. He established his own coinage system within Egypt, and you had to convert your coin to go in and out of Egypt. You had to have your metal melted down and reissued in Egyptian coins, and there's a profit to the state both ways. But notice, of course, there is nothing Egyptian about this imagery. That's a Hellenistic monarch, and there is the characteristic Ptolemaic Egyptian eagle on the reverse there, and that was made at Alexandria. And those coins carry on being issued throughout the whole period. Believe it or not, all his successors issued coins with his portrait on it. So there's a kind of sustained continuity of the Ptolemaic royal image in the coinage. And Ptolemy I, who is a successful warrior, intervenes in a number of wars around, gradually increasing Egyptian power, for example, over into Libya. We've got him in the middle there, and the coin again on the left. But he also, and that's at Tuna El Gabel on the bottom right, down in the subterranean tomb of Temple of Thoth. And there is, it's the same throne name as Alexander. So it's either Alexander or it's Ptolemy I. And what you've got here is Ptolemy sort of blurring himself, if you will, with Alexander now that he's king. Now, Ptolemy I was celebrated really because he charmed his enemies. He was very good at sort of, for example, with rivals' armies, he would offer them food and sustenance and shelter and all that kind of thing, rescue them, and they would often come over to him. He doesn't get everything right. He also has a number of women and a large number of successors, and he certainly leaves some possibilities, and that of course ends up with a lot of rivalry after his death. Again, that's an unbelievably complicated story, as the entire Ptolemaic saga is, but let's just say we end up with Ptolemy II, Philopator, lover of his father, and his sister wife Arsinoe II. Now, how Ptolemy II gets to that point is a whole other story in its own right, but here we have got sibling rulers, and there's no actual suggestion at this stage that these two were lovers. She was probably too old by that stage. She already had children by previous marriages. Now, Arsinoe II is here very much being depicted, as a joint monarch. And that's an important thing to understand, is that you see the rise of the Ptolemaic female king. And there's a gradual development of the notion of the female Ptolemaic ruler alongside the brother husband. But there's also a divine backing to this as well, because of course it suits the whole depiction of the Ptolemaic pharaoh within the theology of Egyptian gods, to identify them that way. And there was even a poet who also combined that, with Zeus and Hera as well. So it's very much part of that. Now, Arsinoe II is celebrated a number of different ways, and this is the Middle Kingdom pyramid of Amenemhet III, and in the front you've got there the remains of the labyrinth, so famously described by Herodotus in his histories of Egypt. And it was Ptolemy II who dismantles the entire thing to build a new city in the name of his sister wife, and that's why there's only bits and pieces there now. Now, it's during this period of time that Alexandria really starts to take on its great fame as the center of learning and architectural development, the showcase of Alexandria, of Ptolemaic power. And we've got here an engraving of the Pharos, the lighthouse, which belongs to this sort of period. Very interesting, because that's the inscription that's supposed to have been on it. Sostratus, son of Dexiphanes of Cnidus, on behalf of all mariners to the saviour gods. And, that's often quoted. And I do think it's very funny that archaeologists and historians very rarely look these words up. Sostratus means lifesaver. So it's obviously not his real name. Sostratus is hardly likely to have been born with the name Lifesaver and then thought, oh, as I'm called Lifesaver, I'd better build a lighthouse. It's obviously an assumed name, and that actually, that happens all the time in the ancient world. And I really am amazed that people don't look these names up. It nearly always turns out they can't possibly be the birth names. But anyway, obviously one of the most celebrated sites at the time. There's also the Serapeum. Now, Serapis is a conflation of Apis and Osiris. And although it's not a Ptolemaic creation, Serapis certainly existed beforehand. It's not quite clear exactly where he came from. Ptolemy I, that is, undoubtedly recognizes that Serapis can be, if you like, the religious foundation of Ptolemaic Egypt. So this becomes the closest thing to the state cult, and there are Serapeums all over Egypt. And this one is supposedly the one in Alexandria. There's also, of course, the one at Saqqara, which is the necropolis of Memphis. I'll just throw in for those of you abroad, not perhaps familiar with this, it is a remarkable fact that at the beginning of the 3rd century AD in York, in Britain, there was a Serapeum built in the name of the the commanding officer of the 6th Legion. That's hundreds of years later, of course, but it just shows you how far-ranging worship of Serapis became. And then, of course, there is the famous library. Now, the library is very famous, but it's famous really for being famous because nobody knows anything about it apart from the theoretical contents of tens of thousands of books, which, of course, were scrolls that nobody knows the name of a single one of them. Nobody knows how it was catalogued. It's really, if you like, become the inspiring dream of libraries, but without anybody having really the slightest knowledge of how it was used. We do know, of course, that Alexandria became the home to a number of scientists and historians and writers who flooded into the city, attracted by the resources that Ptolemy II, Ptolemy III were prepared to devote to the development of this and to create the place as a showcase Hellenistic city. They also developed the Fayum. Now, the Fayum is famously the Great Depression to the west of the Nile, and it's the Ptolemies who go to quite a lot of trouble to develop this as a very important farming center. It's also because it means that they can control it. So it's one of the most fertile parts of Egypt. And it's in the Fayum, quite often in the rubbish pits, the leftovers of some of the villages and towns here, that so many of the papyri that tell us vast amounts about how Egypt was run under the Ptolemies have survived. Very little, of course, comes from Alexandria, where the conditions mean that they just don't survive. But in the Fayum, that's a different story. And that means that you've got documents from Alexandria here and other documents that are destined to go to Alexandria. You don't find them in Alexandria itself. But the Fayum is of vital importance. Lots of stories about the various villages and officials and farmers and rebels and priests and people who lived there. Now, if we look at it towards just in the second half of the 3rd century BC, what we've got here is a kind of picture, if you will, of the Hellenistic kingdoms. So you've got Macedon up at the top left. The brown part is the Seleucid Empire, descended from Seleucus I, another of Alexander's generals. And there you've got in purple the Ptolemaic kingdom. And as you can see, it stretches right the way across to Libya. Now, the stripy bit, which we will recognize today as being where southern Syria and Lebanon and Israel are today, and Palestine. The regrettable and very tragic truth is that that part of the world has been under dispute for thousands of years, and it was certainly just as true under the Ptolemies. It's that place, Sidi Syria, that corridor of land, if you like, between the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemies that is under absolutely constant dispute. And these Hellenistic kingdoms throw vast amounts of resources into swaggering displays of military power and naval success and etc. And there are endless wars. There's loads and loads of wars in Syria. And they never really get anywhere because none of these states is actually powerful enough to prevail over the other. And it is precisely this that ends up destroying them. Now, Tacitus, the Roman historian, said of the British tribes, individually they fight, collectively they are conquered. Now, he was talking about Britain in the 1st century AD. He might just as well have been talking about the Hellenistic kingdoms, including Ptolemaic Egypt, because that was what was going to happen. Because what you're looking at here, folks, is the Eastern Roman Empire, 300 to 400 years later. Now, the military posturing reaches ludicrous extents, and my favorite there is the Tessera Conteres down at the bottom there, which is Ptolemy IV's ridiculous 400-oared ship, which apparently couldn't even actually sail. It's just really there as a kind of statement for the hell of it, a complete white elephant. Of course, the Ptolemies do have an army, and it's based a lot on mercenaries they have to hire in. It's all very expensive. It's a fantastically costly option, and that's what they are farming Egypt for. That's really the whole purpose of Egypt for the Ptolemies, is that Ptolemaic Egypt will be the resource which the Ptolemaic military aspirations, their territorial ambitions, can just be paid for by the ordinary Egyptian peasant. But the Ptolemies do pose from time to time as people who can help out. There's this terrible low flood of the Nile in 238 BC, which is a catastrophe for Egypt, a very low inundation. And so the Canopus decree is where Ptolemy III and Berenice II record the amount of help that they have given to the Egyptian people and try to reform things. Of course, bearing in mind that most Egyptians couldn't actually read that stele, but you can be sure that that was swaggered about. But it's the way the Ptolemies do, if you will, try to pay the social rent. Now, life under the Ptolemies, I'm just in my book, I've structured it in three parts. There's the rise of Ptolemaic Egypt, there's life under the Ptolemies, and then there's the end. So a very quick look through some facets of life under the Ptolemies. And what you've got there on the left is a late Ptolemaic sculpture, very obviously classical, but with the Egyptian Nemes headdress. And then you've got a Ptolemaic queen there. And that image of power is absolutely essential as part of the legitimization within Egypt. And I do need to point out that there's very much a clear distinction in Egypt. There are the ruling Macedonian Greeks and there are the ordinary Egyptians. There's a certain amount of blurring. You don't get the Macedonian Greeks learning Egyptian or observing Egyptian words, but what you do find is a certain number of Egyptians who become literate, probably functionally literate in Demotic, which is the late form of Egyptian written language, and some Greek, and some of them seem to adopt Greek and Egyptian names so that they can be one or the other, depending on what they need to do in terms of business. But it is very much a bit of a Raj type arrangement. Raj, I mean, in terms of India, where you had the British ruling India. Here you've got the Macedonian Greeks ruling in Egypt, and it's very much that upper class. And this is where the Greek comes from, because it's a Greek ruling class. And so there's a couple of instances of these papyri. House sale 224 BC, a grain loan 124 years later. There's just astronomical quantities of these documents, but of course only a microscopic fraction of the original ones survive. And there is a whole hierarchy of administrators leading all the way down from the top in Alexandria, right down to lowly officials within your village who are enforcing and administering this. There's even a daily, almost like a Pony Express type arrangement in which there's various postal stops in which this material can be sent back to Alexandria, and other invectives, requirements, orders, whatever are sent out. And there's a very typical example of this sort of thing is the grievance of Apollodorus. And Apollodorus is an oil contractor in a village called Kirkosiris. And Apollodorus is very aggrieved that Siswas, a local chap, seems to have been holding out on some oil, which he's supposed to have handed over. Now, I should explain that Apollodorus was a tax farmer. He will have bid for the tax dues on that settlement. He has to pay those up to the state, but it's up to him to get the money off the taxpayers. And he's very annoyed by Siswas because he won't pay up. And so he goes round to Siswas' house, and Siswas and his wife beat him up and lock him out. And so Apollodorus goes back with a bunch of heavies, and there's another massive punch up, and all this gets filled out into bits of paper. Now, the truth is, of course, that Siswas probably was taking a slice of the action for himself, pocketing the goods, but it's also probably true that Apollodorus was also lining his own pockets as well, but he, needless to say, doesn't mention that about himself. He's full of allegations about the crooked Siswas. And, you know, there's one aggrieved taxpayer or tax collector or whatever after another. It's a fabulous archive, the most extraordinary number of stories, and I can barely give you more than the most casual taste of it. Now, as I said earlier, Alexandria is the centerpiece of this. And I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that title. Some of you may remember the novel called Neville Shoots a Town Like Alice. Actually, do you know, the funny story is that I thought of that, and that's how this book started, believe it or not. I was originally going to call it A Town Like Alex. Anyway, it's just a chapter title now. So that is absolutely the epicenter. And it's great having that plan, isn't it? But of course, most of Alexandria is submerged under the sea, long since gone. And nobody really knows the plan of ancient Alexandria at all. As I've mentioned the Serapeum earlier on. There's a few traces and fragments of it down below there at the bottom. I don't need to linger on that particularly. And then we've also got the temples, the more typical temples of Ptolemaic Egypt, where they very deliberately emulated the classic Egyptian temple design with the pylons and the courts, but they do it to a much higher technical standard. Whereas those of you who've been to Luxor will have noticed what a bedraggled collection of bolt-on extras that place is. It's the original accessory temple, isn't it? It knocks somebody else's bits down, reuse it in yours, and nothing's really quite symmetrical or organized, and one pylon after another. Not so here with the Temple of Horus at Idfu, which is very organized, although it's in the process of building for the best part of 200 years. It's all very much built to a cohesive plan, and on it there is Ptolemy the 12th, beating up his enemies in traditional standard, but there is also Ptolemy the standard, Ptolemy the 12th. I've overlaid there in a more typical format for the Hellenistic court. So that's the two images. We've also got Ptolemy the 12th there being, that's at Komombo, and that shows Ptolemy the 12th there being worshipped by various gods, two Horuses. Two Horuses better than one, I suppose. And so that and Thoth on the left there, Isis behind him, and presumably Sekhmet. I'm not quite sure where. I think it's Sekhmet next to Ptolemy the 12th there. But anyway, there he is being validated by the gods, and that's a back view of the whole thing. Of course, this is from the birth house there, but the obelisks that were in front of it have long since gone. Of course, the paint has gone, and so have the flagpoles, but nevertheless, it is the most magnificent surviving example of Egyptian temple architecture. And there, of course, is the inner open court, and that takes you back through the hypostyle hall to the sanctuary at the reverse. And there is the plan, and you can see how very coordinated that is. And if you compare that even with the Temple of Luxor, which is simpler in layout, to Karnak, I think I probably said Luxor earlier on. I probably meant Karnak with the one pylon after another. So apologies if I made that slip. But if you think of the Temple of Luxor, which is a simpler structure than Karnak, it still looks relatively chaotic and make it up as you go compared to the Temple of Horus at Idfu, which has very obviously been built to a plan. And then a beautiful 19th century painting there, recreating some of the sense of the surviving colour. And that's back down to Philae, which I mentioned right at the beginning. Again, similar concept there. Now, there's in Alexandria the royal graves. I mentioned the tomb of Alexandria, tomb of Alexander, and there at the top right is Augustus Caesar coming to visit the supposedly astonishingly well-preserved grave of tomb of Alexander, accidentally breaking off his nose. Well, that's a great story, isn't it? Except there are no royal graves. Now, anybody who knows Egyptian history will know that the history of mummies is an awful lot invested in history of mummies. So a load of people who think that all the secrets and solutions to Egyptian history lie in the bodies of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. And if you can only pin down the DNA and everything, you'll have all the relationships and all the history will magically come into view. But all everybody ever does is argue about that. And as far as the Ptolemies are concerned, the Ptolemies are saved that infliction because there aren't any bodies, there aren't any tombs, although they were famously supposedly there. That is the more sarcophagus of Nectanebo II, which ended up as a bath tank in Alexandria. How it got there is anybody's guess, but it's in the British Museum now. And above that is the tomb of Mausolus in Halicarnassus, which is possibly a little bit like what the Ptolemaic tombs look like. But if they did, we don't know. They're gone. So there's no mummies, there's no nothing, there's no DNA, etc., etc., etc. We do have some relatively high status Ptolemaic coffins here, and these are some of them, but actually Ptolemaic tombs are very thin on the ground. The vast majority of people ended up like this. I took those out in Bahariya in the Western Desert, where the ground is just literally covered with the desiccated remains of ordinary people of Greco and Roman date. Now, the fall of Egypt, we're rattling on, I can see it's already 25 to 2. That was taken from Lindos in Rhodes, and that's the southwestern coast of Turkey, Asia Minor or Anatolia in the distance, and that is the sea around which so much Ptolemaic power was ranged, and that's what really mattered to the Ptolemies. However, over in the west, you've got the Roman Republic, and this is going to be ridiculously quick, but Rome was really had no ambitions outside Italy in the early 3rd century BC, but its greatest rival was Carthage across in North Africa, and a great dispute blows up over Messana in Sicily. And the result is the Punic War, the First Punic War. Now, the Romans don't have a navy. They have to copy the Carthaginians, and they do it so effectively, they start beating the Carthaginians. And the end result is that they end up winning the First Punic War. And that is a real shock to the Carthaginians. And it's later in the 3rd century BC that the Carthage has really kind of come back. It controls Spain. Italy has really, so Italy is still really the central piece of Italian power. It's got Corsica and Sardinia and Sicily, but that's really about it. But the Romans and Carthaginians go back to war because the Romans are very put out by the Carthaginians coming back. But it's an absolute catastrophe, despite the fact they have this remarkable navy. And the Romans are nearly destroyed by several battles in the Second Punic War, which occur in Italy because the Carthaginians have come round. I'll just go back on that. The Carthaginians have come all the way across the Pyrenees and the Alps down into Italy, and then they beat the Romans at Lake Trasimene and Cannae in 217 and 216 BC. And like Alexander's death, that should have ended the Roman world. If Alexander hadn't died, Hellenistic power would have remained in a completely different shape and form. If Trasimene and Cannae had wiped out the Romans, the whole of classical history would be really completely late classical history would be completely different. But the Romans forever come back. Now, during this time, the Ptolemies are on the last big peak point, and this is Ptolemy IV, who defeats Antiochus III, the young Seleucid leader, at Raphia in 217 BC. And yes, that is the Raphia that you hear about in Gaza today. It's the same place, as I said earlier. It's that flashpoint in Ptolemaic Egyptian history, in its wars with its rivals. And Ptolemy IV prevails, but he doesn't really follow it up because he hasn't really got the resources to do so. So instead of pursuing the battle, instead of marching on into Seleucid territory for a decisive crushing of the Seleucid Empire, he doesn't do so. He withdraws. And it's such a confusing history, and it's all in my book, but I've tried to simplify it. I can't really go into detail about it now. It's in 202 BC that the Roman Republic defeats Carthage in the Second Punic War at Zama. And that defeat, led by Scipio Africanus, later called Africanus in celebration of this, is the pivotal point, because that really tips the Romans into an era of seeking more and more power, more and more territory, of having so much power and influence in the Eastern Empire that these subsequent Ptolemaic kings have to look increasingly to the Romans to prop them up. And it happens little by little. The subsidies are gradual. Now, Ptolemy V married Cleopatra I, who is Syrian, and these pair are very important because it's from their descent comes the rest of the dynasty. Cleopatra here, this is her Horus name. Again, we've got another, and that's her cartouche down at the bottom there, but her Horus name is right up at the top there. And this now you see, some Egyptologists make a great deal of this. Oh, that's very important. You know, Horus name, you've got to show vast amounts of respect to all of this, blah, blah, blah. However, this is on a very small bit of relief buried in a corridor at the bottom of the Temple of Edfu, which means that no one, apart from a very small number of people, would have ever seen it, and even fewer would have been able to read it. So I'm just not quite sure how significant these titles are, because they never appear on the coins. So a queen, a Ptolemaic queen, is Basilissa on a coin. The king is Basilios. You never see any of these flashy Egyptian royal titles on the coinage, and that is a very big part of everyday commerce and life in Ptolemaic Egypt. So one has to recognize, I think, that these are largely honorific. Now, there are rebellions because, of course, the Ptolemies are increasingly exacting in their dominance of Egypt, crushing people, really trying to get everything they can out of them. And this results in two nationalist rebellions. And the most important is Harwanepher and Aquanepher at Thebes. Very humiliating for the Ptolemies. It lasts a number of years. Look at that length of time. It's 18 years, during which time there is this separate enclave. And it's a mark of how Ptolemaic power down the Nile Valley is not something that the Ptolemaic rulers can take for granted. Now, elsewhere, we've got Antiochus III. He dies during an assault on a temple. He's killed, and Perseus of Macedon is defeated by the Romans. I'm sorry, I've left the closing bracket out there, at Pydna. And that's Roman power expanding increasingly into the territory. Ptolemy V, so hell-bent on exploiting his court and followers in order to pay for his regime, he's killed by a conspiracy in 180 BC. And then we end up with the extraordinary phase of Ptolemy VI and VIII. And this is a world of just staggering bestiality. And because of the lack of time, I really can't talk about it very much at all here. I'm going to whip forward just firstly taking into account that in 146 BC, the Romans take Greece, and they also defeat Carthage for the third time. And in 133 BC, Attalus of Pergamon leaves them his empire because he doesn't want it to be split up on his death. He didn't have any sons. So that has expanded Roman power even more into the east. So the Ptolemies are increasingly on the back foot, and they are looking all the time more and more to Rome to prop them up. So their own dynastic disputes turn into things that the Romans have to deal with. So Ptolemy VI marries his sister Cleopatra, and we also then have this extremely complicated situation, which I think I'm just going to whip through to the family tree there so you can see this. This is how complex it gets. So Ptolemy VI rules with his sister wife Cleopatra II and their brother Ptolemy VIII. However, when Ptolemy VI dies, Ptolemy VIII marries Cleopatra II, subsequently divorces her, and then marries her daughter by their brother, Cleopatra III. And as you can see, she is the mother of Ptolemy IX and Ptolemy X. And from them are descended the rest of the dynasty. So yes, that is indeed exactly how it worked. And this is it. This is from Comombo here, and you can see there they are: Cleopatra III, Cleopatra II. Because although he's divorced his sister, she's still there. So there are the three of them specified on the hieroglyphs in their capacities. And eventually, what ends up after Cleopatra II is dead, we have Cleopatra III ruling with her one after another of her sons. Ptolemy IX and Ptolemy X is her favorite, but he's going to end up bumping her off because he's so sick of the control she wields. And that extraordinary sculpture, which is in Vienna, that's Ptolemaic royal female sculpture. Now, I had to steal from the novelist George Eliot for this, so I wrote this passage to describe Cleopatra III. She dominated her family and the state with an ardent lack of self-sacrificing attention. The effect of her being on those around her was thereby incalculably destructive, and indeed it was. This is just a litany here of what took place. So Ptolemy X murders his mother, and we end up with Ptolemy IX coming back, and then Ptolemy IX rules with his sister, with his daughter Berenice III. At that point, Ptolemy XI is pushed on by Sulla, the Roman general, who is now interfering. He kills his stepmother after 3 weeks, and the Alexandrians are so cross about that, they kill him. So the upshot of it all is that we end up with the probably illegitimate Ptolemy XII Auletes, who rules from 80 to 51 BC. That's the so-called flute player. Now, Ptolemy does something remarkable. Although by then Ptolemaic Egypt is really beleaguered and on the back foot, he does a remarkable job of negotiating with the Romans, which actually keeps him in power. He retains power. He manages to get a Roman guarantee, and he's backed up that. But he's in hock to Julius Caesar, who has lent him huge amounts of money, and it's Cato the Younger in Rome who tells Ptolemy, "You just don't realize there's so much greed and ambition in Rome. They'll eat you up and destroy you." And while Ptolemy XII is in Rome, he's basically vanished. As far as the Alexandrians are concerned, they stick his daughter Berenice on the throne while he's away. He reappears, comes back, and kills her. He's so angry that she's been on the power, but she's been in power, and then he dies himself a few years later. And then, of course, we have the era of Mark Antony, Caesar and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. This is Cleopatra VII, who is Ptolemy XII's younger daughter. Incidentally, I like to point out with this coin of Antony and Cleopatra, if you look at the noses, you can see the portraits are basically so similar. It's not really a lifelike portrait of either of them, and certainly not Cleopatra. Now, of course, everybody famously knows that Cleopatra was only interested really in her own power and securing an independent, autonomous Egypt, and that's what she seeks in Julius Caesar to begin with. She beguiles him into it, of course, visits Rome, where she horrifies the Romans. Cicero, the Roman lawyer, said, I hate the queen, he said. They just detested that whole Oriental influence. But of course, Caesar is Caesar interferes in the civil war in Egypt, and that's when the Alexandria library gets burnt down, and has a son by Cleopatra who is Caesarion, Ptolemy the 15th. And you can see there in that sculpture that's Thutmose the third on the left, and you can see the sort of stylistic resemblance and the differences there really between the two. And he is, of course, going to be a bit of a problem for the Romans. Of course, Caesar is assassinated in 44 BC. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus form the Second Triumvirate, which they determined to go after the tyrannicides of Julius Caesar. And during that civil war, they eventually split the empire up between them. Antony takes the east, which means he controls the Egyptian area, and as we all know, he takes up with Cleopatra. And actually, the funny thing is there are some books on Ptolemaic Egypt that don't even mention Cleopatra VII because she's not considered to have been that important, really. She isn't really, not really, not to the administration and running of Egypt. She's very much turned her direction elsewhere. Of course, in 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra's army and navy are defeated at Actium by Octavian. This is, of course, because Octavian and Antony have disastrously fallen out over the revelation that Antony was going to leave the Roman Empire to his children by Cleopatra. Now, we end up, of course, Octavian is able to annex Egypt in 30 BC, which is what he does, and there is Octavian as Augustus in the middle on a relief at Karnak, and I was very lucky the sun came round at exactly the right moment there. And of course, Egypt becomes a great trophy, and there is an Egyptian obelisk in a piazza in Rome. And I'd just like to finish up there with the Oracle of the Potter. And I'm just going to read you the last short paragraph from my book. The Egyptian nationalist Oracle of the Potter, composed in the late 2nd century BC, prophesied how the foreigners, the Macedonian Greeks, whom he dismissed as belt or girdle wearers, would fall like leaves from the branch. The statues taken away would come back. Alexandria would become a place to dry fish. The guardian spirit would return to Memphis, and a new king would come, under whom the forsaken Nile would be replenished and the trees bear leaves. That messianic king never emerged, but the ruined Ptolemies were gone, and the Romans in turn after them. Today the old gods still watch over Egypt and the Nile from the temples embellished with their images, and this antique land is once more in charge of its own destiny. If you have been, thanks for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Guy. That was excellent. And well done for covering such an incredible sweep of history. It's really kind of masterfully, I should say. Thank you so much again, Guy, for that incredible
Not at all.
lecture. And thank you, folks, for joining us. Just to reiterate that this recording will be available online. And yeah, stay tuned for more lunchtime events. And thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everybody, for listening in today.
Goodbye.